Which player has had the greatest single season in MLB history? It's been a hot topic over the past few years, with Aaron Judge hitting 62 home runs and posting a .210 OPS plus in 2022, Shohei Ohtani dominating in the batter's box and on the mound in 2023, and Aaron Judge somehow one-upping himself so far in 2024. People have been asking how they stack up against the greatest seasons of all time, and some people have made the case that Ohtani or Judge may hold the number one spot. Of course, the most popular answer for best season ever, at least among fans younger than 40 who don't care about steroid usage, is probably 2004 Barry Bonds. His 1.422 OPS that season is an MLB record, and apparently he wouldn't have even needed a bat to get on base over 60% of the time. Among more recent seasons, other popular answers include 2000 Pedro Martinez, 2001 Barry Bonds, 2002 Barry Bonds, 2003 Barry Bonds. Older fans may make the case for 1923 Babe Ruth, 1941 Ted Williams, 1967 Carl Yastrzemski, or 1968 Bob Gibson, but none of these guys are my pick for greatest season ever. According to Baseball Reference War, the most valuable single season was 1883 Tim Keefe, but my vote goes to the fourth guy on the list, Jim Devlin. Unless you're a true baseball nerd, there's a pretty good chance you've never heard of Jim Devlin before. A YouTube search of his name yields 0 relevant results, and a Google search spits out only his baseball reference page, a Wikipedia article, a single article by The Guardian, and a Saber page for a completely different baseball player with the same name. I first stumbled upon Jim Devlin's baseball reference page back in January, while working on a Fixing the Hall of Fame project. That project resulted in a spreadsheet with 571 players, 36 tabs, color coding, and an on-the-fence-o-meter. I also wrote 42 pages of script for an accompanying video that will, in all likelihood, never exist. I wanted to make sure I was thorough, and considered all sorts of weird and interesting Hall of Fame cases beyond the obvious Lou Whitakers and Bobby Gritches. And weirdest and most interesting among the players I discovered is Jim Devlin. I mean, just look at this page. Only 3 seasons, which on its own is pretty unusual for a successful ball player, but he pitched more innings in those 3 seasons than Mariano Rivera and Jacob deGrom did in their entire careers. So far, at least. I'm still optimistic for a deGrom comeback. A career 1.90 ERA, but more losses than wins. Only 7 home runs allowed in 1,405 innings pitched, which, as that gold indicates, is an MLB record for career home runs per 9. And can we look at that 1875 season for a second? A 7-16 record to go along with a 1.93 ERA is absurd. But what's even more absurd is that ERA was apparently only 18% better than league average. And to top it all off, somehow, with a 1.93 ERA, his pitching WAR was negative for the season. WAR was much kinder to him the following 2 seasons, though. His 31.7 combined WAR between 1876 and 1877 is the second highest total for 2 consecutive seasons in MLB history, behind only 1883 to 1884 Old Hoss Radbourn. Despite his pitching WAR being negative in 1875, his overall WAR was actually positive that season, thanks to a 131 OPS plus. And oh look, there's 2 extra seasons here. Devlin started his career primarily as a mediocre first baseman, then, during his most successful offensive season, apparently decided he would start throwing the ball too. He also apparently decided to make up his own pitch, as he is commonly credited with being the inventor of the sinker. Take that with a grain of salt, of course, it is the 1870s, and there is absolutely no definitive proof whatsoever that that's true. Devlin would end up finishing his career with a 104 OPS plus, making him an above-average hitter in an era where pitchers had just as many plate appearances as position players did. With a minimum of 1,000 innings pitched and 1,000 plate appearances, he's one of just 16 players throughout the entirety of MLB history, with an ERA plus and OPS plus both above 100. Among them, he has the highest ERA plus, which shouldn't be surprising considering he's 5th all-time in that stat and 4th among starters. Let's return to that 1876 season though. On the surface, it's obvious that the season was incredible for Devlin. A 1.56 ERA and 168 ERA plus over 622 innings pitched, 315 batting average and 115 OPS plus over 299 plate appearances, 18.3 WAR, just like completely ridiculous numbers. But a deeper dive reveals just how fascinating 1876 was for Devlin and his team, the Louisville Grays. 1876 was actually the inaugural season for the National League. It replaced the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, taking 6 of the National Association's teams and adding 2 more, for a total of 8 teams. These 8 teams were the Hartford Dark Blues, who folded after the 1877 season, the New York Mutuals, who folded after the 1876 season. And fun fact about the Mutuals, by the way, they were originally owned by Boss Tweed, that corrupt New York City politician that you learned about in your middle school history class. The Philadelphia Athletics, who folded after the 1876 season and have no relation to the other Philadelphia Athletics that would later become the Kansas City Athletics, who would later become the Oakland Athletics, who would in the future become the Las Vegas Athletics. The Cincinnati Reds, who folded after the 1879 season and have no relation to the other Cincinnati Reds that would form 3 years later and still exist today. The Boston Red Stockings, a franchise that didn't fold sometime in the 1870s and does still exist to this day. As you can probably guess, they are now the Atlanta Braves. The Chicago White Stockings, who did not become the Chicago White Sox, but did become the Chicago Cubs. The St. Louis Brown Stockings, who folded after the 1877 season, but would later be revived as an American Association team in 1882, although technically they were different franchises, and then they would be renamed the St. Louis Browns, then they would move back to the National League in 1892, and then be renamed the St. Louis Cardinals in 1900. Then, in 1902, 2 years later, an American League team named the Milwaukee Brewers, no, not those Milwaukee Brewers, moved to St. Louis and renamed themselves the St. Louis Browns, just 2 years after the original Browns became the Cardinals. Then, in 1953, the team that was not the original St. Louis Browns, but was the original Milwaukee Brewers, would move to Baltimore and become the Baltimore Orioles. They wouldn't be the original Baltimore Orioles, though, because the original Baltimore Orioles are now called the New York Yankees. And the Louisville Grays, team of Jim Devlin. The Grays would fold after the 1877 season. So, to recap, the first National League season was played by the Mutuals, the Dark Blues, the Grays, the Athletics, who are not the Athletics, the Reds, who are not the Reds, the Red Stockings, who are not the Red Sox, the White Stockings, who are not the White Sox, and the Brown Stockings, who are not the Browns, but are kind of the other Browns. Got it? Good. Time for a statistical analysis. Now, these statistics may be too advanced for some people, so just try your best to keep up. In 1876, 6 of the 8 teams were named after colors. That's 75% of teams. In 2024, only 1 of the 15 National League teams, or 6.666666666666666% of the league, is named after a color. Additionally, at least 3 of the 8 teams in 1876 were named after socks, with the Reds sometimes also being referred to as the Red Stockings. Yes, that's right, a league of 8 teams, and 2 of them were called the Red Stockings. I'm sure that wasn't confusing. Anyhow, that's either 37.5% or 50% of teams being named after socks, depending on how the Cincinnati team was feeling on any given day. In 2024, 0 of the 15 National League teams are named after socks, which is 0% of the league. Over 148 years, the percentage of National League teams named after colors has decreased by 68.3%, and the number of National League teams named after socks has decreased by either 37.5% or 50%, again depending on whether the Cincinnati team felt like going by the Reds or the Red Stockings. Forget the Bob emergency, the National League has a sock emergency. Fortunately, the American League is holding down the fort with 2 sock-named teams, as well as 3 color-named teams. Jim Devlin. Guy was really good in 1876. The rest of his team, though, not so much. Despite the ridiculous 18.3 WAR and 1.56 ERA that we've already discussed, you may have noticed that Devlin actually had a losing record of 30-35 in 1876, which seems completely impossible. How can you lose more games than you win while only allowing a run and a half per game? Well, before I continue to make my case for why I believe this is the greatest season of all time, I do need to mention something that may weaken Devlin's case in some people's opinions. Devlin only allowed 108 earned runs in his 622 innings pitched in 1876, but he allowed an additional 201 unearned runs. So while his earned run average was 1.56, his total run average would only be 4.47. 2 additional factors to take into account here, though. First, Jim Devlin pitched in an extremely hitter-friendly ballpark. While very little information is available online about Louisville Baseball Park, and I was not able to find any dimensions for it or anything, Baseball Reference does have a park factor stat that determines how pitcher-friendly or hitter-friendly a ballpark is. With this stat, 100 is neutral, over 100 is better for hitters, and under 100 is better for pitchers. To establish a frame of reference, the worst park for pitchers in 2024 is Coors Field, of course, with a park factor of 107, according to Baseball Reference. In 1876, the pitching park factor for Louisville Baseball Park was 127. The gap between Louisville Baseball Park in 1876 and Coors Field in 2024 is nearly triple the gap between Coors Field and a neutral ballpark. StatCast also has a park factor stat, and they rate Coors Field's park factor for 2024 slightly higher, at 112. Still not even close to being as bad of a place to pitch as Jim Devlin's home stadium was for him. This is the primary reason why, even though Devlin's 1.56 ERA was only slightly better than Tommy Bond's 1.68, Devlin's ERA plus was 25 points higher. Devlin put up similar numbers in a much more difficult run environment. Second factor to consider, it was standard in the 1870s to have a massive disparity between runs allowed and earned runs allowed due to the ridiculously high number of errors. Remember, most players weren't even wearing gloves in the field yet. In fact, every pitcher in the National League had more than twice as many runs allowed than earned runs in 1876. For Devlin, though, the gap between runs and earned runs was wider, which goes back to the fact that, even though he was fantastic, the rest of his team was not. Here are the top 10 players on the 1876 Louisville Grays ranked by WAR. Yeah. Of course, it was expected that a team's primary pitcher would lead the team in WAR in the 1800s since they usually pitched like 400 plus innings, but the 16.6 WAR gap between Devlin and Joe Gearhart in 1876 is the second largest single-season gap between the team's first and second most valuable players, behind only the New York Metropolitans' Tim Keefe in 1883, the season he was worth 20.2 WAR, which was 17.1 WAR higher than Candy Nelson's 3.1. The WAR gap between Devlin and Gearhart was the largest by far of any team in 1876. The next biggest gap was the 6.7 WAR separating the Hartford Dark Blues, Tommy Bond, and Candy Cummings. What's interesting about Bond and Cummings, though, beyond the jokes that could be made about their names, is that they were both pitchers. Bond pitched about 65% of the Dark Blues innings, and Cummings pitched the remaining 35%. Devlin did not have this luxury. Of the 643 innings pitched by Grays pitchers in 1876, Devlin pitched 622 of them. And it's a good thing he did. The three pitchers who pitched the remaining 21 innings allowed 35 runs, although only 13 of them were earned. Oh, and one of them was 16 years old apparently, and never played a professional game again outside of the 4 innings pitched and the 2 hitless plate appearances he had during one game in 1876. He was also the Grays' 9th best player by WAR in 1876, as his lack of playing time made him less detrimental to the team than those who played more. So we've established that the 1876 Louisville Grays had poor fielding. We've established that, outside of Devlin, they had poor pitching. But what about offense? Let's take a look at the 9 Grays hitters that had more than 100 plate appearances in 1876, sorted by OPS+. Huh, would you look at that? The only above league average hitter on the 1876 Louisville Grays by OPS Plus was Jim Devlin. Not only did he throw 622 innings on the mound, he also led the Grays in plate appearances, hits, doubles, extra base hits, runs scored, and was second on the team in runs batted in, one behind Charles Fulmer. The team slash line for players not named Jim Devlin was a putrid 241, 249, 284. At first glance, it seemed impossible that someone with Devlin's stats could have a 30-35 record. After looking at the rest of the team though, it still seems impossible, but for the opposite reason. Jim Devlin somehow managed to single-handedly make his team competitive. The Philadelphia Athletics were a much better team than the Grays overall in 1876. They had 5 batters with an OPS plus over 100, including stars George Hall and Levi Mayurl, who had a 204 and 162 OPS plus respectively. The Athletics team OPS plus was 104, compared to a lackluster 73 for the Grays. The Athletics went 14-45 in 1876. They won 16 fewer games than the Grays. The Grays were not better than the Athletics, but Jim Devlin was better than the Athletics. As Foolish Baseball once wisely said, baseball, at its core, is a series of 1v1 matchups between the hitter and the pitcher. I'm now the second person to rip off this quote from him, but hey, at least I'm giving credit. Bailey makes this statement in the year of Ohtani to demonstrate how much more of an impact Ohtani had as a 2A player in 2021 compared to the rest of the league. He points out that Ohtani faced 533 batters as a pitcher in 2021 and had 639 plate appearances as a hitter, for a total of 1,172 total batter-pitcher matchups. He points out that this number is 250 more than Zach Wheeler, who had the second most total matchups in 2021. These 1,172 total matchups took place throughout a 162-game season, of course. As a pitcher, Jim Devlin faced 2,568 batters in 1876. As a batter, Jim Devlin had 299 plate appearances. He played in 68 of the Grays' 69 games and was involved in 2,867 of the team's 5,274 batter-pitcher matchups. That means that 54.36%, yes, more than half, of the plate appearances during Grays games in 1876 featured Devlin as either the pitcher or the batter. I don't think I can emphasize this enough. 54.36% of the total baseball played by the 1876 Louisville Grays was played by Jim Devlin. By comparison, 2021 Ohtani, who, as a reminder, was way ahead of anyone else that year, was involved in only 9.59% of the Angels' total matchups. The player with the second most total matchups for the 1876 Louisville Grays was Bill Hague, who was involved in 5.61% of the total matchups and was worth -0.2 WAR. Jim Devlin wasn't just head and shoulders above the rest of his team, though. In 1876, he stood head and shoulders above the entire league. His 18.3 WAR was 7.9 wins higher than Tommy Bond, the player with the second highest WAR that season. That is the largest gap in WAR between the number 1 and number 2 player in a season in MLB history. Even in Tim Keefe's 20.2 WAR 1883 season, Old Hoss Radbourn was only 5.9 wins behind him. In fact, third place Jim Whitney was closer to Keefe in 1883 than second place Bond was to Devlin in 1876. And in 1884, when Old Hoss Radbourn had the second most valuable season of all time with his 19.4 WAR, you'd have to go all the way down to the 8th best player, Billy Taylor, to have as much of a WAR gap as there was between Devlin and Bond in 1876. You thought Barry Bonds dominated baseball in 2004, right? Well, he did lead MLB with 10.6 WAR, but the difference between the best player and the second best player in 1876 is the same as the difference between Barry Bonds and Joe Randa in 2004. Randa, by the way, ranked 159th in WAR that season. 1877 was another fantastic season for Devlin. He led the league in WAR once again with 13.4, and he was involved in over 50% of his team's matchups again, this time being responsible for 54.9% of all of the total baseball played by the Grays, a higher percentage than 1876. In fact, Jim Devlin was the only pitcher to pitch for the Grays in 1877. Every single pitch that the Grays threw to the 2,328 batters they faced across their 559 innings in 1877 came out of the right hand of Jim Devlin. This is the only time in baseball history that one pitcher threw every single pitch for his team in a season. The Grays did have a slightly better team behind him in 1877, though. Their hitting had improved to almost league average, led by the addition of George Hall and his 133 OPS plus from the now defunct Philadelphia Athletics. They still weren't a good team, but giving Devlin even a little bit of help was enough for the Grays to find themselves in first place with a 27-13 record by the middle of August. Following a win against the Chicago White Stockings on August 13th, the Grays were 4 games ahead of the second-place Boston Red Stockings with 21 games left to play. They were 14-2 in their last 16 games heading into their game against second-place Boston on August 17th. During that 16-game stretch, they scored an average of 7.625 runs per game, while allowing an average of only 4.5625 runs per game. Then it all fell apart. Louisville went 1-10-1 over a 12-game stretch from August 17th to September 13th, with the tie being a 1-1 game, and the only victory being a narrow 3-2 win over the last-place Cincinnati Reds. During this stretch, they lost 4 games to Boston, 3 games to the Hartfords of Brooklyn, and most shockingly, 3 games to the lowly Cincinnati Reds, who would go on to finish the season with a 15-42-1 record. They went from being 4 games up on Boston for the top spot in the league to being 6.5 games behind. Sure, teams go through hot streaks and cold streaks, but this total collapse for the Grays is different. They didn't just lose a bunch of games, they seemingly forgot how to play baseball. The number of runs the Grays allowed remained fairly consistent with the rest of their season, but their 7.625 average runs scored per game from the previous 16 games plummeted to 1.66 runs per game over this miserable 12-game span, and they failed to score more than 4 runs in any game during this period. They were shut out 3 times on August 21st, August 27th, and September 6th. They had only been shut out 1 time in the 40 games before August 17th. Then, on September 14th, they were back to normal as they beat the Reds 12-6. Just as suddenly as they had fallen apart, they had put it all back together again. They finished the season by winning 7 of their last 9 games, apparently remembering how to hit again in the process, as their offense jumped back up to producing an average of 5.44 runs per game. It was too little too late, though. The hole they had dug themselves was too deep to climb out of, and Louisville finished 2nd in the National League, 7 games back of Boston. And that's where Jim Devlin's baseball story ends. 18.3 WAR in 1876, 13.4 WAR in 1877, then never played professional baseball again. What's this? It looks like the Grays' second best player, George Hall, didn't play after 1877 either. That's strange. In fact, it looks like 1877 was the last season for the Louisville Grays franchise. Let's see. Best team in the league suddenly and inexplicably forgets how to baseball. Then following the season, the team folds, and its 2 best players, including the best player in the league, never play professionally again. If I didn't know any better, I'd say this sounds like... yeah, there it is. You see, before there were Cy Young and Walter Johnson to name awards after and refer to as baseball's first GOAT pitchers, there was Jim Devlin. Before there was Shohei Ohtani, excelling at both pitching and hitting and being involved in way more batter-pitcher matchups than anyone else in the league, there was Jim Devlin. And before there was Shoeless Joe Jackson, ruining his career by accepting money to throw games, there was Jim Devlin. Now, the details of what I'm about to discuss are a bit hazy. As we've already talked about, the internet doesn't really have much to say about Devlin. I found that the most comprehensive and reliable source on this topic is a Society for American Baseball Research article by Daniel Ginsburg, and I will be relying on it heavily. If you'd like to give it a read, I'll put a link in the description. Halfway through the 1877 season, the Louisville Grays allegedly stopped paying their players. Ginsburg's article does not directly mention this, but other sources do, and Ginsburg does include a supposed quote from a Grays player that alludes to it. I think this is an important element of the story. Devlin, and all of the other Grays players I'm about to mention, were not getting paid the money they were owed for their work. While it's impossible to say for sure, I wouldn't be surprised if that played a major role in the decisions that they made during the 1877 season. According to Ginsburg, a gambler from New York City known mononymously as McLeod had approached Devlin sometime in 1877, offering him money to throw games. Devlin initially declined until George Hall suggested that the two of them work together to throw games in order to bolster their incomes. Devlin agreed and sent a telegram to McLeod. The first 2 games that were thrown were exhibition games, for which Devlin was allegedly paid $100 each. According to Ginsburg, Devlin gave Hall $25 of the $100 for the first game, but kept the entire $100 for himself for the second game. In addition to Hall and Devlin, utility player Al Nichols was also involved in throwing various games, and shortstop Bill Craver was presumed to have been as well, although, unlike the other 3, he never admitted to it. It didn't take long for people to realize that something was awry. If we could tell just from looking at the game scores, imagine how obvious it must have been for people who were actually watching these games take place. Team president Charles Chase became suspicious, not just because of his team's sudden poor play, but also because of the unusually large number of telegrams that Al Nichols had been receiving. Hall eventually admitted to Chase that he had taken money to throw games, and in response, Chase called the entire team to his office and demanded that they allow all of their ingoing and outgoing telegrams to be read. All players agreed, except for Bill Craver. According to Ginsburg, Craver allegedly told Chase, quote, "You can open the telegrams if you will pay me the 2 months' salary you owe me," end quote. Which, by the way, is absolutely an appropriate response in this situation, regardless of whether he was involved or not. And there is no real evidence that he was. Nevertheless, his refusal to let his employer, who hadn't paid him his salary in months, read the 1800s equivalent of his text messages, caused him to be permanently banned from baseball, along with Nichols, Hall, and, of course, Devlin. There is an account from Al Spalding, another star pitcher of the 1870s and founder of the Spalding Sporting Goods Company, who was apparently in National League President William Holbert's office sometime post-scandal when Devlin entered. Devlin allegedly approached Holbert's desk and begged on his hands and knees for another chance. Holbert, allegedly, responded by giving Devlin a $50 bill and saying, "This is what I think of you personally, Jim, but damn you, you have thrown a game. You are dishonest, and this National League will not stand for it." I'm sure there is absolutely no fabricating going on there, and all of that happened word for word. Devlin eventually went to work as a police officer in Philadelphia, but he never got over his banishment from baseball. Legend has it that Devlin sent letters to Holbert every day for the remainder of his life, begging for forgiveness and for a return to baseball, but Holbert never gave in. In 1883, Devlin died of tuberculosis. He was only 34 years old. He has since faded into obscurity, unknown by most fans of the game he loved, and when his name is mentioned, it's only in articles calling him baseball's original cheat. And frankly, I don't think that's fair. Devlin's accomplishments during his short career were incredible, and he deserves recognition for that. Even though he admitted to throwing games in 1877, he was still the league's most valuable player that year. In fact, the games that the Grays lost in the summer of '77 were due to a lack of scoring, not poor pitching. Devlin actually allowed slightly fewer runs per game during their 12-game slide than he did during the 16-game hot streak that immediately preceded it. And while the integrity of the game is certainly important, let's not ignore the fact that the 1877 Grays were not getting paid the money that they were owed. If your employer stopped paying you for 2 months, and someone else offered you money to sabotage your employer a little bit instead, you're telling me you wouldn't take it? Personally, I see that as a power move. How are the guys that lost a couple of baseball games on purpose the bad guys here, instead of the team owner who refused to pay his players? Pay your employees, and maybe this wouldn't have happened, Charles. You know what? I'm gonna say something bold. Let's get Jim Devlin a plaque in Cooperstown. Greatest season of all time, career home runs per 9 record, inventor of the sinker, those sound like Hall of Fame credentials to me. Yes, he took money to throw games, but in a way, he was a martyr. Game fixing and corruption were rampant in the early days of baseball. In fact, one of the primary reasons that the National League replaced the National Association in 1876 was because of the National Association's corruption. Devlin and his teammates took the fall for something that many other players had done, and were made an example for what would and would not be tolerated in the future of the National League. You could say that Devlin lacked integrity, but I'd argue that no one did more to improve the integrity of baseball than Jim Devlin.